Message from outer space to the viewers of this video. Please enjoy our coverage of the 2022 Exeter UFO Festival. The views expressed in this program are those of the speakers. They do not reflect the views of Exeter TV, the Town of Exeter, or the Select Board. To learn more about the festival, visit exeterufofestival.org. Start video countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Blast off.
Though she has been an empath her whole life, she has only been investigating the field and work as co-founder of the KRI Center for Consciousness Studies, which operated for more than 10 years before closing in 2019, while being founded by her empath support gathering, which continues today. Valerie is a member of the Seacoast Paranormal Research Group and co-hosts the Exeter Extraterrestrial TV show on Exeter, New Hampshire Public Access, who we are very glad to have manning our AV here today. In addition to reaching people through her writing and connecting with other empaths, she is continually looking for opportunities to work with and learn more about these strange things that happen in our world through paranormal investigations, clearings of homes, businesses, and land, doing in person and sometimes in person and strange activity, whether you think it is paranormal, ET, cryptozoological, or something else, and would like Valerie and her team to help. Please send her a email at the address below, which I'll give in a moment. Valerie has been a lecturer at the Exeter UFO Festival here in New Hampshire and has been heard on radio and podcasts such as Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno, Spirit Radio, The Paranormal Experience, Mac Maloney's Military X-Files, The Paranormal Matrix, Mud Pie Podcast, The Leak Project, and I Want to Believe podcast. She can be contacted on her Facebook page, and her email is, you'll have to give it, Valerie, it's written so thinly in blue ink, the way I printed it out. I'm sorry about that. Her talk is entitled, Aliens in Our Backyard. Please give a warm welcome to Valerie Lofaso.
Good morning. Wow. See where I can put my water where it won't fall over. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. All right, wow, this is a big crowd. You guys are all here so early. I'm so impressed. So thank you to Peter for reading what is a mouthful so early. I apologize for that. If you do want any information on any of the stuff he talked about, I do have a table. You can come by and see me afterwards. So I'm just going to jump right into this. On a dark night in 1980, a 4-year-old girl was riding with her dad in his old blue Pinto hatchback, heading home along an unlit road in Derry, New Hampshire, after running a quick errand together. Though they had driven that road many times before, something was different that night as they made their way up the steep hill. Her dad's unease, his anxiety, filled the cabin of the small car. He urged the girl to hide behind him, and without question, she did as he asked, crouching on the floor in the space between his seat and the back seat. He reached his arm back so he could touch her and know that she was there and safe. It was his fear that alarmed her, though she wouldn't ever be able to say she was truly afraid. Something unusual was going on, but she was curious and excited. That curiosity got the better of her, as it likely would for the rest of her life, and she managed to peek around the seat back. Looking out the windshield, she could see a green phosphorescent glow that illuminated the black night sky and silhouetted, always have trouble with that word, silhouetted the familiar hilltop. She was little, but she knew it wasn't normal for any sort of light to be in that spot. They crested the hill, and what was on the other side, what was emitting that glow, would change her life, even while hiding in her subconscious for over 3 decades. So that incident would hover in my mind, like I said, for over 30 years. I would tell myself, that was just a dream, right? But if you guys are vivid dreamers like me, even the most vivid dreams tend to fade after a while. And this dream never faded for me. My life, which was fairly normal, took a drastic turn in about 2005 or 6 when I first heard the term empath. I heard it on a fairly popular paranormal TV show called Most Haunted. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. It's a little bit wacky out of the UK. And a medium on that show was talking about somebody who is an empath. And as I heard him describe what it was, the light bulb went on. It was me. He was talking about me. I could recognize what he was talking about. And I finally had a reason why I felt kind of weird my entire life. So do you guys know what an empath is? Anybody not know what an empath is? I see a couple hands. So I'm just going to give you a kind of a brief description of what an empath is. So an empath is a person that is highly attuned to the feelings, emotions, and energy around them. Empaths are typically seen as outsiders. They are often introverted, and they're usually observing and absorbing everything going on around them. And taking everything in and processing it means that we are often seen as standoffish, aloof, or shy. So just to put it into perspective, everybody in this room has energy. This building has energy. The computers have energy. I am absorbing all of that energy and processing it as I stand here. So when I learned the term empath, I was a single mom. I was trying to be a writer, and I was searching for a place to belong. Writing my ghost stories, which had been a passion of mine since I was a little kid, led me to wanting experience in ghost hunting. I was writing about it, but I wasn't doing it. I had a couple experiences when I was younger with ghosts, but it wasn't like being in it. So I looked for a group to investigate with, and that was when I found the Seacoast Paranormal Research Group, which does still exist today. That was in 2009, I found that group. In 2011, some of us within the SPRG group opened the KRI Center up in Stratham. Some of you who, if you've been here in years past and heard me speak with some of my friends from the KRI Center, you may have attended events there as well. So when we opened in 2011, one of the first events that started, it was started by my friend Mike Stevens, who you will see on the trolley here today and speaking tomorrow. He was doing a group called Social Saucers. And it was kind of a casual discussion group for anyone who was interested in ufology. And I would go to the meetings. It was once a month. And I went mostly to support Mike and to support the center. You know, my interest was fairly casual at the time. But as I kept going to events, my casual interests started to change, and it was challenged. We had events in ufology, paranormal, spirituality, manifesting, we had events in all of this stuff. And we had guests. We had big name guests like Kathleen Martin, who's here today, Travis Walton, and Ronnie LeBlanc, who's now on Expedition Bigfoot. But we also had a lot of local people, local investigators, filmmakers, researchers, and people just seeking, like I was, for a place to belong. So having exposure to all these different types of people with all their different experiences really started to broaden my own curiosities. And then I took an intuitive development class where I learned that being an empath is how my intuition works. It is picking up on the energy of living people, dead people, animals, plants, land, buildings, that sort of thing. I started to really learn about that. But I was really surprised when I learned that I could also connect with not just dead people, but non-human energies and even ETs. So going to social saucers and listening to experiences of other attendees, talking about the research, combining that with the heightened awareness that I was gaining from developing my intuition, meant that I finally started to ask questions like, was it really just a dream? And that's when I started getting answers. You ask a question, you hope to get an answer. I started getting answers. One of the first answers I got came in the form of this, similar to this image here. If you all live in the seacoast or really anywhere you live, you'd be driving down the road, it's a foggy night, up ahead there's a traffic light and it's green and it's causing a green haze. There was one night when I was driving home from the KRI Center, and I was going up a hill, and in the distance was a traffic light, and it was causing a green haze because of all the fog that night. And I felt anxiety, and then I felt a familiarity. And then I realized there was a sense of something missing. And it was around that time when I went, I've had this feeling before. I remember all through my life, similar experiences, driving foggy nights, seeing the green glow of the traffic light and feeling those feelings. And I started to think that, okay, maybe there's a little more to this. So the next answer, the next sign, came to me again at a social saucers group when an experiencer was talking about an encounter she had with something that is known as the Michelin Man ETs. Everybody know, we heard Michelin Man ETs. It's essentially this drawing up here. Hearing her talk about that, I kind of went, yeah, there's something familiar about that, but not quite right. It wasn't quite right. There was a hazy something that I couldn't quite put my finger on when she talked about that. And the more I thought about it, the more I said, okay, if you take the Michelin Man image there, add a green glow to him, and then add a Scooby-Doo monster to it, you have what was living somewhere buried deep in my mind. I didn't quite know what it meant. I felt like it had meaning, but it's so easy to doubt ourselves with these experiences. I can say I was 4 when that happened with my dad. I was watching Scooby-Doo. I loved Scooby-Doo. So maybe it was a figment of my imagination. And then another sign came. So that's my father, and that's me on his lap. It wasn't quite around 1980, that was a couple years before. I think I was about 2 in that picture. My father passed away in 1997, And I wasn't even close to investigating any of this stuff. I wasn't aware of any of this stuff. So I never was able to have a conversation with him in life about any of this. But I was developing my intuition. And doing that, you form relationships with spirit guides and deceased loved ones. And my father was a regular visitor. So there was one night when I said, okay, I'm going to ask him about this experience. Was it just a dream? And he refused to talk to me about it. Now, that's significant because he was very protective as a father. He was still being protective as a father in death, even though he was in a more pure soul form. So that spoke to me of some very deep link between him and myself to what happened that night. Because if it had been just a dream, he would say, Val, it was just a dream, or I don't know what you're talking about, or any number of things he could have said other than not talking to you about this. That cemented in my mind that, okay, I think this really was something more than just a dream. But as you know, doubt still creeps in. So that famous group, Social Saucers, that I keep mentioning, there was another incident, or not an incident, but another night when, we tried to bring in guest speakers. We tried to have topics ready. We always were looking for things to get people interested to come. And even, it was always a well-attended event, but there was one night when our friend who was in the audience, I believe, Dean Merchant, I saw him floating around here somewhere. So if you don't know Dean, he's a local historian, journalist, and ufologist, and he founded the Exeter UFO Festival with his wife in 2009. And he came to the Social Saucers gathering that night with a map. And this is not the map that he brought. This is kind of the best I could do to try to find something to take its place. But he brought in a map of hotspots in the area. And for the life of me, I can't remember all of what he talked about, because as soon as he pointed out that Route 28 in Derry, New Hampshire, there's a lot of sightings along there. I didn't hear anything else after that, because that's where my sighting happened. This is a closer up view from Google Earth. That little yellow pin, if you can see that, is about where I had my experience. Does anybody here know Derry, New Hampshire? Okay, so many of you probably know Route 28 and Route 28 bypass in Derry. So where we were was around the Ryan's Hill area, heading towards the Wyndham border. So the fact that other people had experiences in that area shocked me, which it shouldn't have. Of course other people had had experiences in that area. I should not have been surprised by that. And you would think that all these things combined would help me talk about it. Don't worry, parents, if there are any little kids here, you don't have to cover their eyes. Even though signs were coming up for me, I was getting hit in the head constantly, talk about this, talk about this, talk about this. There was still that fun thing, fear. Fear of ridicule. I was a parent of a young kid. I was divorced. What if her friends found out and made fun of her? What if my ex found out and gave me problems for it? What if people didn't believe me? As an empath, as someone who also experienced years of bullying and verbal abuse, I had learned to find all of my flaws and faults, I think, so that if someone else tried to throw them at me, I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be hurt by it. I could brush it off easier. So because of that, I already knew in my head, if I told my story, I knew the possibilities of what doubters could say. My story wasn't cool enough. It wasn't awe-inspiring enough. It wasn't amazing. It wasn't scary. It wasn't this, that, or the other thing. Add to that, am I credible? You know, I'm not a researcher the way some people here are researchers. I don't work for the government, you know, seems like if a government worker sees a UFO, everybody believes them, you know, and I'm not in the military. However, my father was, he was in the Navy. You know, I'm not an expert. Plus, add to that, I'm emotional. You know, you don't want to believe emotional people, you know, and I'm a writer of fiction. So, of course, I can make things up really easily. Why would anyone take my story seriously? Why would anyone care about my story? Of course, I didn't say any of this aloud, kept it to myself, and continued on in my silent quest, listening to others and supporting others, and speaking very little. But I kept getting nudged, as we often do. Those of you who are, you know, who do this stuff, you know, you kind of get those little shoves on the back. So I started to get comfortable at some of the events saying that, yes, I'm an experiencer. I had an experience when I was 4. It happened in Derry. That was about all I was brave enough to say to anybody. And then someone at one of our groups mentioned another incident that happened in Derry to me. Rainbow Lake. Has anybody heard of this incident? Okay, a couple hands, but not a lot. So I'm going to read right from the Derry News article that was published on Tuesday, October 2nd, 1973. Manchester resident Harold Robertson was driving along Route 28 bypass when he saw a bright object hovering in the sky over Rainbow Lake. When he went closer, he heard something crash into the lake. Several residents who live by the lake reported 2 objects. They were described as whitish yellow in color, the size of a steering wheel, or 2 or 3 feet in diameter. The witnesses reported the objects descending toward the lake, then one fell straight down and crashed into the lake, creating ripples along the shore. The second object soared upwards and vanished. East Derry Fire Rescue Squad searched by boat for 2 hours but found no trace of the object. Derry police reported receiving over 40 calls about the UFO sighting, but speculated that the objects were meteorites, military paraflares, or my favorite, swamp gas. Now, like I said, I'm not an expert. If there are any experts on swamp gas, I would love to know if 2 balls of swamp gas can go in 2 different directions like that, and it doesn't make sense to me, but what do I know? So here's a Google Earth view of Rainbow Lake. It's a fairly decent-sized little lake. So there was a follow-up article the following week reporting that divers did go in and search the water, but visibility made it difficult and they didn't find anything that could explain the sightings. One of the divers said that the only way they're going to get anything out of the lake is to drag it. But the chief had no plans to do that, so the matter was closed. So after reading those 2 articles, I went, okay, I gotta see if there was anything else about Rainbow Lake ever put out. And I came across one more piece in the newspaper on Thursday, July 16th, 1981, so several years after the incident. It was written by a man named Conrad Quimby, who is listed as publisher and editorial page editor. And it was in a section titled Off the Cuff. And he was basically griping about a real estate ad for property on what was termed crystal clear Beaver Lake. And if you've ever been in Beaver Lake, which I grew up in Derry, I've never been in Beaver Lake because it was always kind of gross. You know, he was upset that realtors were trying to make these places sound better than they were just to sell property. He was blaming these developers for renaming mud holes to sound better, pointing out that Rainbow Lake was apparently once known as Upper Shields Pond, and that natives, he claimed, still call it the Snake Pit. But this last part is my favorite, and I'm going to read a direct quote from him. "We can remember when Rainbow Lake was so swampy it oozed a cloud of methane gas once that glowed so much that one shoreline resident called the paper to report the landing of a UFO." Now, this is a newspaper guy that's full of inaccuracies in that one little sentence. You heard what I read. There was several witnesses who lived on the lake, one man driving, and 40 calls into the police station about this UFO. And here he is blaming swamp gas once again. And this is why I am excited for Peter Robbins' lecture tomorrow on the origins of UFO ridicule, because this is a great example of what we always have to deal with, and why, people like me now are scared to talk about our experiences, because, well, if the wrong person hears this, these are the things they're going to say. So I found that ridiculous and interesting at the same time. So a lot of synchronicities tend to happen in this field, whether it's ufology, paranormal. This next experience I'm going to talk about happened on the Derry-Londonderry border around 1980 or 81. And this story came to me, so I'm very involved in the paranormal side of things, and I did a paranormal ghost hunting 101 lecture back in June at a library in Epping. And one of the attendees reached out to me afterwards and wanted to talk more about the paranormal, so she and I got together. And after a nice lunch and great conversation around paranormal and spirituality, she asked me if I was going to be doing any more lectures anytime soon. And I mentioned the Exeter UFO Festival, and she kind of looked at me, Exeter UFO Festival? And I said, yeah, I'm an experiencer. I had an experience in Derry when I was a kid. And she goes, oh, I have an 89-year-old aunt who had a UFO land in her backyard in Derry. And I went, what? This is what being brave enough to talk about it leads to. It leads to hearing other stories. So I immediately said, okay, can I meet your aunt? Can I talk to her, please? And she arranged a meeting with her aunt. I am keeping the exact location. I'm not letting out the exact location. I'm keeping her name anonymous for now, and you'll find out why towards the end. So her story, just so you know, it's where she lived was about 3 miles from where my incident occurred, and she believes it happened. She couldn't remember if it was 1980 or 81, but that's right around the same time I had my experience. And she thinks it was February or March. She was having trouble sleeping one night. She was in her early 40s. Her kids had all grown and moved away, so all of the kids' bedrooms were empty. So she was going from bedroom to bedroom trying to find a bed that she could get comfortable enough to fall asleep in. And then a bright light came in the window of the room she was laying in at the back of her house, and it caught her attention. So she looked out and saw a craft about 20 to 30 yards away. She went to her kitchen to get her glasses. She didn't have her glasses with her, and went back to the window, and it was still there. So this is a very rough, hand-drawn sketch of a sketch that she did that was rough as well. But this is what she described. It was triangle in shape with a rounded bottom, and it was a gray metal. There were windows along the right side, and she said she could see heads in the windows. She described the shape of the heads as being similar to a fetus. And she couldn't see the details of the heads, but she knew they weren't looking at her. The left side of the craft, she said she didn't remember actually seeing the left side. She just remembers the window side, but she assumed that what is drawn there is what was there. And then I asked her, because as an empath, this is one of my first questions, you know, what did you feel when you were standing there looking out your window, looking at this thing? And she said she wasn't scared, she was only curious. And she watched it for, she didn't know how long, but it felt like a good period of time, probably more than 20 minutes. And then it zoomed straight up out of sight with no sound. She went out the next day, first thing in the morning, and there was not a single mark in the ground, and she couldn't believe it. She even said, when I spoke to her, she's like, I don't know how it didn't leave marks in the ground. So here's some of the really curious things about her encounter. One of the reasons why it was profound for me, she's very faithfully religious. She has been most of her adult life. She's a born-again Christian. And she said to me, I'm not supposed to believe in these things, but I know what I saw. You know, how amazing is that? Like, everything in her religion tells her this doesn't exist, you don't see this, this isn't what you think it is, but she said, I know what I saw. Her husband at the time was a helicopter pilot, thought that was kind of curious, and she would talk about her experience, oddly enough, in her church group. And she ended up finding that two other friends of hers had two separate encounters with UFOs at different times in the Londonderry area. One of them, she was an adult and she had, I think, 6 kids with her, and they all saw the craft, and I can't remember the details of the other one. And then here's the last piece that really spoke to me. She said that prior to this night, she had some severe emotional problems, some of which led to some short stays in a hospital. And she has not had a single one in the 45 years since she saw the craft. Pretty profound, if you ask me. And it also reminded me of Travis Walton, who I'm sure most of you know. He got abducted and has had amazing health ever since. So I'm putting together this lecture and, you know, all right, what other incidents have happened in Derry that are out there? And I found this one. Came up over Robert Frost Farm. If you know Derry, you know Robert Frost Farm. It's got a huge field and lots of woods out behind it. And at first, I didn't take this report seriously at first. I watched the video. This is a clip of it. You can't really see it very good because of the sun, but that's a closer up snip of the craft that was caught in this report. So this is from April 11th, 2014, and if you Google UFO Derry, New Hampshire, it will come up. You can watch it on WMUR. This is from Eric Poor. He is a real estate photographer from Derry, and he was practicing flying his mini quadcopter with a GoPro camera on it when he captured this. But he didn't know he captured it at first. He was just testing his copter. It was on the ground at the time. He was getting ready for it to take off. And when he got home, he watched the video from it, and that's when he saw the object. It crossed the sky in roughly half a second. He had to slow the video down, and it covers about 12 frames. When I heard that, I kind of went, okay, that's probably not just a bug. And then he actually contacted MUFON, and a man by the name of Mark Podell, who's a MUFON investigator, or was at the time, I'm not sure if he's still with them, he came out and investigated the incident and stated that he believed that it was either an experimental craft from our government or another government, or an off-world craft. And he also commented that at the time he was receiving 5 to 10 new reports of sightings a month in New Hampshire. So I thought that was neat. And so when I did first come across this incident, it caught my attention. Here's another image of Robert Frost Farm and a Google Earth view of where it is. You can see the fields and you can see all of the woods around it. So there was a time not too long ago where I finally decided I would ask my mom if my dad ever talked to her about UFOs. And I said, you know, at dinner one night, did Dad ever mention a UFO encounter? And she says, no, but I think I saw one over Robert Frost Farm one time. And I was like, Mom, I've been doing this for how many years and you're just thinking to tell me now? So I asked her if she remembered what she saw. She thinks it was probably late 70s. At the time, you know, my brother and I were little. My dad was working full-time, and she was working a night job. So my dad would come home from work, and my mom would go work at the mall up in Manchester, New Hampshire. So she had to drive by the Robert Frost Farm every night. And she believes that, you know, what she saw, she said, was a quick gleam of light for a few seconds going parallel just above the tree line and heading south. She thinks it was possibly the fall in the late 70s. So, you know, it could have been anything, but I just thought that was interesting that, okay, here's more than one report in the same location. So again, I apologize, the sun's making it hard to see this, but this is another Google map. On the bottom, you can see where my experience happened. The next pin up is Robert Frost Farm. If you can see the red line, it's roughly 2 miles from where I had my experience to where the Robert Frost Farm is. And then the pin way at the top is Rainbow Lake. It's about 4 miles from Robert Frost, so about 6 miles from my house, and that's pretty amazing straight line. And then, so my encounter to the anonymous encounter, it's about 3 miles, and that encounter to Rainbow Lake is 4 miles. So you have a pretty good triangle right there. And the reason this map is a little, I could have done a closer up view of it for you, but I wanted you to see another landmark that is really, really close to where all of this happened. If you can see down in the corner, that's America's Stonehenge. We're about 10 miles from America's Stonehenge. And I can tell you, most of you know what America's Stonehenge is, so I don't really need to describe it, but it's, you know, it's pretty amazing. It's, you know, nobody knows who built Stonehenge, and it's been featured on numerous paranormal and ufology podcasts and TV shows, including Ancient Aliens, which, you know, I think is very fascinating. But I want to bring it back to Derry for one more interesting, odd story. Some of you might have heard of it. I was pretty mad that when I heard of this story and when I grew up there, and I never knew about this when I lived there. Like, I don't know how that happens. So if you can see the star, it's right in the midst of the triangle. The legend of the Derry Fairy. Has anybody heard of the Derry Fairy? Okay, good. I'm not the only one. So this is a bit of a murky story. Again, I found an article from the Derry News written in 2008, November 13th, 2008, by a man named Richard Holmes, and I'm going to paraphrase the story that he told a little bit. On December 15th, 1956, a man named Alfred Horn went out into the woods of Derry to harvest Christmas trees. He looked up from his work and was startled to see something staring silently back at him. It was, to his amazement, a little green critter that stood only about 2 feet tall. He described the thing as being neither human nor animal. His or her skin was green and wrinkled, much like that of an elephant's. Its head was dome-shaped, with ears that hung down like a basset hound's. on its face were holes where its eyes should be, and these eye openings were covered with a clear film like that of a reptile. Extending out from its torso were short little legs and arms with stubby hands and toeless feet. To prove his story, he jumped on the little critter to try to capture it. Yeah. And immediately, the Derry Fairy began to scream so loudly that the man was terrified and ran away. And our little green visitor was never seen again, as far as we know. So the man who had this encounter, not a whole lot is out there about him, but he lived on Berry Road in Derry in the 1940s and 50s, and that's where that star was in the map that I showed you. And it's fairly likely that he was probably close to home when he was harvesting these trees. So that's pretty interesting. And we know that the story originated in a pair of letters. Okay, this is where it gets really good. A pair of letters written in 1962 and 1964 to Boston astronomer Walter Webb, who is a well-known writer and researcher into the truth behind UFOs. He was also a NICAP member, which is National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomenon. And guess what? He's one of the people that investigated the Betty and Barney Hill encounter. So that's pretty significant in my mind that he was confident enough in what he saw that he was writing to a well-known ufologist on this. You know, he called it, or somebody called it, the Derry Fairy. I don't know if he was the one that coined that name. You know, normally you think of a fairy and, you know, it's an elemental, it's an earth spirit, but I don't know, it kind of sounds like an ET, maybe, you know, kind of makes me wonder. But as anyone who researches and is interested in any of this stuff, it will tell you that it's not always black and white. You know, how can you label something if you don't really know what it is? We can say it's an ET, we can say it's a fairy, we can say it's this, that, and the other thing, but we don't really know. It's so hard to label these things. So what does this mean for us all? It's a really hard question to answer. So I'm going to give you a few facts first. The National UFO Reporting Center online database has 1,113 reported sightings in all of New Hampshire, 15 of which are in the Derry and East Derry area from between January 1991 to September 2020. So almost 30 years worth. Now that's just the reported sightings, and that's just on this one site. I didn't report my encounter, and I had another encounter in Derry when I was 12. I didn't report any of that. I haven't reported any of my encounters. Shame on me, I know. You know, and I'm sure there's a lot of other people out there like me who don't always report what they see. And then there's other reporting databases as well. So, but the fact that there are 15 reported sightings in that area no longer surprises me. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about empaths and encounters. So one of the events that we used to have at the KRI Center with my friend Mike was an encounters gathering, and it was for anyone who had an ET or UFO encounter could come and talk about it in a safe place. No judgment, no fear of ridicule. And there was one event, and I think it was actually after one of the Exeter UFO festivals, you know, I think people were ready to talk. We had, I think, about 15 people in the room, which was a lot for us. And one of the questions, I may have been the one to ask it, I don't actually remember, but we asked, how many of you think you're empaths? And everybody but one person in the room raised their hands. And I thought that was really interesting. I hadn't ever, I just thought being an empath was a spiritual and emotional thing. I never thought about it as, well, maybe there's something to this as far as, are we more susceptible? Are we more tuned? Is there some reason why we are having these encounters? And then at the 2017 Exeter UFO Festival, at the panelist show that Paul and Ben Eno put on with their radio show, an audience member got up and asked this question of all the panelists. She asked, are there any theories on empathy? Do aliens show it? It seems like they're not getting what we're feeling. Do aliens feel empathy? So Denise Stoner was one of the speakers that year, and I'm going to read a little paraphrasing of how she responded to that question. As an experiencer, it came across to her that the ETs were serious scientists, but they did show some emotion. They were curious to her reactions, though they were very restrained in demonstrating it. But then she said, most humans with experiences similar to hers come back with a greater degree of empathy, more than they had before. She believed that they were able to empathize with humans more. So whether or not the ETs have it didn't matter to her. She feels that because she was not harmed and she was always returned, she wouldn't ask for it to stop. So she was glad that she was given more empathy towards humans when she came back from her experiences. And if you don't know Denise Stoner, I recommend looking her up or asking Kathleen Martin about her. Speaking of Kathleen responded to this question next. And just so you know, if you're interested in hearing this, the archives on Behind the Paranormal radio show, you can find this show. So Kathleen answered the question by talking about the Dr. Edgar Mitchell Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial and Extraordinary Experiences, known as FREE, although now I believe it is Consciousness and Contact Research Institute. So she was talking about a questionnaire put out by FREE of 3,000 participants asking, have ETs shown emotions and emotional expressions towards you? 75% did observe emotional responses from ETs. They believed that they can sense your feelings, and Kathleen used the term that she believes they are empathic. Then she talked of a MUFON experiencer survey of 500 respondents and said that a majority stated that they felt the ETs were empathic, and that the majority of experiencers stated that they believed they had become more empathic. When she was asked why, she said ETs seem to be very concerned about human behavior, and if we become more empathic, we will become a different society. We won't hurt others because we will feel the pain ourselves. And Kathleen did state that this was just her viewpoint based on the surveys that she researched and from working with other experiencers. So I was sitting on stage with this crew back then, and it was Kathleen Martin, Denise Stoner, Peter Robbins, Richard Dolan, Travis Walton, Stephen Mather-Lees, Carolyn LaRock, and my group of misfits that I was with that year. And I was blown away to hear somebody like Kathleen and Denise talking about this stuff that I felt so deeply about. But I was way too intimidated to speak up myself. Again, I didn't feel I had the credibility of Kathleen or Denise, so I stayed silent and just kind of enjoyed the fact that somebody else said exactly how I felt. So I was too shy that day to speak about it, but I'm not too shy anymore. And in my experience, and based on everything I've heard from others over the years, I believe that ETs are highly emotionally intelligent, meaning that they are adept, extremely adept at managing their feelings and emotions. They do feel. They feel love and joy. They have a sense of humor. I've encountered some with a sense of humor, and they can be playful. They are compassionate and curious, and they are serious. I believe they are all that and more. The phrase for me I always come back to is life as we know it. You know, we're always out there in space looking for life as we know it. But we cannot view ETs as we view ourselves and as we view the other people in this room. We must allow that they are life as we don't know it. But by being empathetic and compassionate and curious with them and with each other in our pursuit of understanding, I think we can come a really long way in understanding more of who they are. As for the human side of empathy, the people who come to my empath support group hear this from me almost every single time, and it's very similar to what Kathleen stated. I believe empathy can save the world. Just think of what a different world we would live in if everyone on the planet took the time to understand one another from their point of view, not our point of view. Step into their shoes and forget your experiences. You know, if everyone could feel the potential pain and grief that their actions will bring on someone before they take that action, there just might be a lot less cruelty, hate, jealousy, and inhumanity in our world. I believe the encounter my father and I had gave me everything I need to be a conduit for empathy. This was their purpose, to help me with my purpose. Despite all the noise and the bad things happening out there, I believe empathy is winning. And it's winning because of people like you. As you sit in this audience and as you listen to the lecturers and you talk to other people throughout the weekend, you will be using empathy. And that is bringing us together and giving us a level of understanding that I don't think we always have with people. But this gives me great hope for our worlds. So that dark night in 1980 was just the beginning of my story. In January 2019, I finally decided that it was time to do a hypnotic regression, and I was able to learn what was causing that green glow, what was on the other side of that hill. I finally had the complete picture. It was far more than I had anticipated, but I still rarely talked of it. However, it was no longer because of fear of ridicule. I'd gotten to the point where I no longer worried as much about what other people thought of my story. I held back because I found how deeply personal the experience was, and I needed time to let that settle in, and I needed time to process it. And then, about a year ago, my friend Paul Eno asked me to contribute a chapter to his next book. And that was when I decided, okay, it's time for me to start talking about my story. So, if you're curious to know more about what was on the other side of that hill, coming summer 2023, Paul Eno's book, Behind the Paranormal 3 Uneasy Skies, about all sorts of UFO and ET encounters, will be released, and my story is in there. Some other things about me. I am working on the empath manual for intuitive development for empaths. I do have a sample of it at my table. If you'd like to take a look, please come by. I also have information on my empath support gatherings. I have an online version and an in-person version once a month. And these are my fiction books that I have. The first 3 are available now, and I do have them here with me. And the 4th one is being worked on. So that is my story, and now you guys get to ask questions. I guess if you have a question, there's a microphone up here. Or I did such a great job, nobody has any questions.
What happened to you at age 12?
I was babysitting, and I was probably within a mile of where the first encounter happened, and the kids were watching some kids movie on the TV in their parents' bedroom, and the parents' bedroom had a skylight, and I was just laying on the bed. I wasn't interested in the movie they were watching, and something flew overhead that did not look normal. Every time I try to draw it, I'm like, that's not quite right. That's not quite, I can't grasp the memory enough to draw it. I may have to do a regression for that. But it was definitely not a normal airplane. I grew up with a father who was in the Navy, who worked on airplanes. I went to airplane museums. We went to the airport all the time. I knew what airplanes looked like. This was nothing I'd ever seen before.
I'm just curious, why there was so much activity in New Hampshire and
I'm not sure about Derry in particular. There just seems to be a lot of activity in New England in general. Exeter, Stratham, Portsmouth, like the entire area, even Raymond has a lot of activity. I do think, there's a lot of theories around, we have the Pease Airport, there's the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, and then the nuclear power plant in Seabrook. That does seem to maybe attract them, a lot of people believe. I don't really know, though. It's a great question. Yes?
Do you think that your father's connection with the Air Force had anything to do with why there was an encounter in your family?
I don't know. A lot of people seem to think that military people have more encounters, or their family has encounters. So I think there's research out there on the connection of that. So it could be part of why we had the encounter. I think it also has to do with the fact that I believe he was an empath as well. I don't know for sure because he died before I knew the term and could ask him about it, but everything I knew about him tells me that he was definitely an empath.
And we have a little bit more of a mapping for your triangle that you have Derry up in Derry.
Okay.
But 1974 area, we're not to be sick late. So when your triangle of your path and your UFO actually starts somewhere, because we were following it, somewhere coming from let's just shoot, what's the Manchester line, coming across, now it's the D6 going up 101, disappearing, crossing the highway, hitting the D6 top of their lake, and then heading down to you.
That doesn't surprise me. Nothing surprises me anymore, I don't think. Yes?
I grew up a family that has lots of sight, going back to, probably 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
The attraction originally seemed to be certainly water, also railroad tracks, and power lines, us we used to look at the 80,000.
Mm-hmm.
They would see things, they would go off and they would look at the power lines, they would just watch your boats. And you talk about how it seemed to be something coming down from the top there, dragging the line, the power lines. And then, I really didn't know about the investment, but then one day, we were something about it, either that
it seems like it does run in families. If one family member's had an experience, chances are good other family members have. You're lucky if yours are willing to talk about it, because they're not always. My daughter did have a sighting one time in Portsmouth. We were driving to the KRI Center and she saw something, and she didn't tell me about it until we got home. I'm like, why didn't you point it out to me when you saw it? She's like, I was too scared. You know, but I think she was 8 or 9 at the time, and I had her draw me a picture of it, and Mike Stevens, I showed it to him, and he was like, oh yeah, I saw the same thing in the area right around that time as well. So he was able to validate her experience. It's hard in that area too, with the airport right there. It's so easy to be like, oh, you just saw a plane flying low. Well, we see planes all the time. We know what they look like, so we know when something looks different. So, yes.
Now that you understand your experience that you had when you were 4, do you understand why your dad didn't want to talk about it?
I do, and that's in the book. I know, I'm sorry. I was hoping the book would be ready by now so I could talk about my whole experience, but maybe next year. Yeah, it was, I will say, he was in his late 30s, I was 4. You think about conditioning of humans that they go through. You know, he was an adult, he was feeling protective. You know, I didn't know any different. I didn't know any better. I was just curious, and he, not so much. Yes?
I know that you spoke about empathy and being empath being such a big factor in a lot of experiences and sightings. Do you think that maybe consciousness is that missing link that hasn't been explored when it comes to the phenomenon? Like, instead of telescopes and scientific gear, maybe that could be an avenue of love.
I think it's a smart scientist who will look at all of it, not just one or the other. I think it all has a part to play. Yes?
You said your dad came to visit you in your dreams. Has he still come to visit you at the present time?
He does, but not in quite the same way he did before. We kind of, our relationship has shifted a little bit. He's more with my daughter now than with me. So.
You're not able, when he does come visit you, you're not able to ask him, or he refuses to divulge what happened? Did you ask him?
So I will tell you that when I did the regression, he was there in spirit form. So he now understands both sides of the coin, and we understand each other better now because of it. I'll say that. I know, that's not a great answer. Yes?
I've been here a bunch of different times. Why do you always get stuck with the 9 o'clock slot?
That's a great question.
The website, navigating this stuff.
Yeah, I know. When I realized that. And it was wrong in all of the newspaper articles because of that. But it's because I'm trying to remain anonymous. I don't want fame to overtake me quite yet. Yes.
And your previous presentation by yourself and the other guys and gals had to do a lot with why are people afraid to share their experiences in UFOs. Do you think things have changed now that you turn on the regular news, ABC News, whatever, and they're talking about it?
I think it's getting better. It's definitely getting better, but the ridicule is still out there. If you followed any of the posts of for the UFO festival this year, New Hampshire Magazine put out something about, I can't remember how they worded it, but they worded it in a very mocking way, talking about UFOs, and that was really kind of disappointing disappointing because I thought we were better than that at this point. But I definitely think it's gotten better. You know, there's a lot more TV shows. You know, the paranormal is very accepted right now because everybody has a ghost hunting show and everybody wants to be a ghost hunter. So it's a lot easier to talk about that. But there's now a lot more UFO shows out there. So I think it's getting a little more mainstream. And I think that's what we need, because if we as a people are like, we don't need the government to tell us anything, we know these things are real, we know they're here, then they'll be like, oh, okay, well, why are we hiding this from them if they're all okay with it? You know, if we can do that, I think we're a lot better off than waiting for them to drop the big news on us. Yes?
Because of the recent terminology change, where they now call them UAPs, do you think that has something to do with the mindset people have about the term UFO and how they sort of place it in a genre of science fiction almost, as opposed to real experience?
It might, yeah. You know, it's funny. Mac Maloney, who's here this weekend, I was on his podcast on Tuesday, and every time I'm on his podcast, he's like, I wish I had a sighting. I've never had a sighting of a UFO, and I'm like, oh, that's too bad. But then he's like, but I did see some really weird things, and he starts telling these stories about these crazy lights that he saw. I'm like, Mac, you've had a sighting. He's like, but I haven't seen like a craft. I'm like, well, unidentified flying object, that is what you saw. You know, I think people just forget, and they want it to be an alien craft. They want it to be this big, amazing Hollywood moment experience. And so if it's not fitting into their expectations, then it's easy to say, well, I didn't have that. Yes?
I'm just my first housing place here, but I'm wondering if you didn't have abducted, or have you had the close encounters on the third time? And what information did the aliens give you?
Well, my encounter with my father wasn't an abduction, but we did get to meet what was on the craft. Other than that, I've encountered many ETs spiritually. You know, as a medium, they come through similar to ghosts. However, their vibration is very different. Now, somebody was waving me down in the back.
Was the empathic community determined what the alien agenda is in these UFOs?
I don't think there's one broad agenda. I don't think anybody has determined a why. Why are they doing this? I think probably, most likely, it's personal to every single person. Because I don't know about you guys, but I've sat in this room and I've heard a lot of different stories, and everybody seems to have a different story, a different encounter, a different reason. I do think broadly that they want to help us be better people. Does seem like that's a big task, but you know, it's a big universe out there, so you never know. Any other questions? Yep.
There seems to have been a lot more experimentation on people in that incident. It's kind of scary stuff, but I don't seem to hear that anymore. Most of the alien encounters don't seem to be scary events. Do you see that?
I think the understanding and knowing that other people are having experiences are helping people to look at the experiences without the fear, without assuming that it was bad just because they were taken. You know, I think early on it was, oh God, I was abducted, this is a horrible thing. But if you can take a step back, talk to other people, really look at the experience, you know, I know other abductees who were terrified by their experience, but then later described it as, you know, it was like they were throwing me a birthday party. That's not a bad experience if they're throwing you a birthday party, you know. So I think it's, you know, we have the human fear, and if we can take that element out and look at it a little more objectively, we'll find that most of them probably aren't negative. However, if people have had truly negative experiences and want to challenge me on that, please, you're welcome to come talk to me. Any other questions? Yes. Okay.
I feel things are escalating faster and faster every year. It's like, I don't know, because you're sitting around with your coat away, you're watching more television now that there's a lot of stuff and such. But it just seems like everywhere, even the shows you watch on TV, or the, find something on the TV to watch. It seems to be escalating, and it just seems to be combining all kinds of phenomena into the one, Skinwalker Ranch, shows UFOs, it also shows like mutilations and stuff like that. It's like something seems to stick like, oh, we're going to top circles here, we're going to do mutilations here, and it's like, this week's stuff and the rest of it, but it all seems to be like, forward, and I actually sense it like a dream, or not even I'm not a dreamer, but just like a dream. It feels like things are speeding up. There seems to be like a timeline or something.
Yeah, it does seem like possibly because all of this is more talked about on different TV shows and in the media, that I think as we become more aware, we realize, like I said earlier in the lecture, it's not always easy to define them. Like, you look at Skinwalker Ranch and you think it's a paranormal thing, it's a skinwalker, but then you have all these weird lights in the sky and we think that might be a UFO, but we don't know it's a UFO. Ghosts are associated with bright colored orbs too, so it's so hard to say what something is, and I think the more we look at these things, the harder it gets to define them. But I think we as a society in general are being challenged by all these things happening to pay attention, to make better choices, and to do right by each other. So, thank you.